The wind whipped across the vast steppe, biting through the thick layers of winter clothing. Snowflakes blurred the horizon as Major Ekaterina Kuznetsova, a seasoned officer of the Russian armed forces, approached the gate of a remote military outpost. The guards, a mix of fresh recruits and seasoned veterans, stared at her with suspicion, their breath visible in the frigid air. She stood alone, her dark coat barely holding against the wind, and without a word, they mocked her for her unmarked uniform. "Lost or spying," one of them sneered. She straightened, her icy blue eyes piercing through the storm. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice unwavering. Laughter echoed, but it quickly faded as the soldiers noticed the calluses on her hands, the hands of someone who had seen combat. At the outpost, they had spent 3 weeks in isolation, guarding against nothing but the storm and the silence that followed. Inside the outpost, Sergeant Dmitry Orlov took a final sip from his coffee mug, watching the snow swirl outside the window of the command post. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the radio. "There's movement," said Private Ivanov, a fresh recruit, his voice cracking with nervous energy. "North Gate, one individual, no vehicle, no visible weapons." Orlov sighed. "TMI, got to be lost or desperate." But Lieutenant Sergei Makarov, leaning against the console, shook his head. "Could be a probe. They might test our response time." Orlov picked up his rifle. "Ivanov, Petrov, you're with me. Makarov, keep an eye on the cameras." The storm howled as they stepped outside, the wind slashing against their faces like knives. They barely saw her through the snow, just a figure standing still at the red line before the perimeter, close enough to be seen but far enough to be dangerous. Her coat, once black, now faded to a dull grey by the relentless weather. No gloves, no hat, and her hair pulled back in a simple knot. She wasn't shivering. That was the first thing that struck Orlov as strange. "Ma'am," Orlov called, his voice muffled by the storm. "This is a restricted military installation. State your business." The woman didn't flinch, her gaze steady, her voice calm but commanding. "I need to speak with your commanding officer." Makarov scoffed. "No papers, no ID. You're not going anywhere without clearance." The woman's eyes shifted to Orlov. "Sergeant, you have 3 options. 1, you let me through now and avoid a scene. 2, you detain me and waste everyone's time. Or 3, you keep playing these games and it will be too late." Orlov's instincts screamed at him, but he held his ground. Too late for what? She didn't answer immediately, just stood there, her posture too calm, too controlled. The tension in the air thickened as they exchanged a long look. "Listen," Makarov said, stepping forward. "You don't just walk up to a military base like this without authorization. Either you show us some ID or turn around." She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a predator might eye its prey. "My name is irrelevant. My credentials are classified. What matters is why I'm here." Makarov laughed harshly. "Great. Another one of those who thinks she's special." Orlov's eyes were locked on her now, watching every movement. Her hands were still, no sign of nervousness. "I'm here for one reason," she said, her voice low and steady, "and that reason is already at your doorstep. You need to let me through now." The silence stretched. Orlov made a snap decision. "Hands where I can see them. We're taking you inside." She didn't resist, her movements fluid and deliberate. As they escorted her to the holding area, Orlov's mind raced. Something wasn't right. She wasn't just some lost civilian. She was dangerous in a way he couldn't define yet. Inside the guard shack, Orlov sat down and pulled out a notepad. "Name?" She didn't respond. "I told you I don't need a name. What matters is what I can do." He wasn't sure what to make of her, but he felt the weight of her words. "And what exactly can you do?" he asked. She didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. "I can keep you alive when this goes wrong. You'll need me." The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity in the stifling silence of the small, dimly lit room. Major Kuznetsova sat unmoving, her eyes scanning the room with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. The soldiers around her shifted uneasily, sensing something more about her, but they couldn't quite place it. Lieutenant Makarov paced in the corner, clearly growing more frustrated. Orlov sat behind his desk, occasionally glancing at her, trying to decide what to do. His mind kept circling back to her words. "You'll need me." But for what, and why her? She was just one woman, A civilian, maybe, but that didn't explain the cold certainty in her eyes. After what felt like hours, the door creaked open. It was Corporal Sergei Ivanov, the youngest of the group. His face was pale from the cold, his cheeks ruddy from the blizzard outside. "Sarge, I've been monitoring the perimeter," he said, hesitating at the threshold. "There's something off out there. I don't know what it is, but something's definitely moving." Orlov looked up, setting his pen down. "What do you mean?" Ivanov stepped closer, holding up the radio. "Listen to this." The crackling radio hummed to life. A distorted voice came through. "Tura, no activity. Perimeter breach." The transmission cut off abruptly. The hairs on the back of Orlov's neck stood up. "Is that our comms?" Makarov asked, his tone suddenly serious. Ivanov nodded. "It's coming from the outer checkpoint." Orlov's heart pounded. The last few weeks had been uneventful, the outpost buried in a constant blizzard. They hadn't been prepared for anything, least of all a breach. "Makarov, get the searchlight ready," Orlov ordered, standing up. "Ivanov, call it in. We've got company." Kuznetsova remained silent, but Orlov could feel her eyes on him, calculating. The storm outside had grown worse, the wind howling like a living thing. The snow, now thick enough to obscure their view, made it impossible to see even a few meters in front of them. Orlov and the rest of the team grabbed their gear and headed out into the storm. The air was biting, sharp against their exposed skin. They couldn't see more than a few meters ahead, and the blinding whiteness was disorienting. Kuznetsova was right behind them, her presence undeniable. Orlov felt her gaze on him, but he didn't dare turn around. His focus was on the task ahead. As they approached the northern gate, the figure finally became visible, standing just at the edge of the snowstorm, a lone figure against the blinding white. She stood still, almost too still, as if waiting for something or someone. Orlov shouted, his voice cutting through the wind. "This is a restricted military area. Identify yourself." The woman didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying them, her eyes sharp and cold, like the ice in the air. "I need to speak to your commanding officer," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. The storm seemed to grow quieter around them, as though the world was listening. Orlov took a step forward, trying to assert control over the situation. "We don't have time for this. Either you show us ID, or we'll treat you as a threat." The woman's gaze never wavered. "I'm not a threat." "But you are," she replied, her voice low and deliberate. "You're already out of time." Orlov's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what to make of her calm, her certainty, the way she spoke. Everything about her screamed danger, but it was the kind of danger that didn't announce itself with violence. Instead, it worked its way into the bones, like a slow poison. "What do you want?" Orlov asked, his voice strained. The woman took a step closer, her movements fluid and effortless. She wasn't hurried, but her presence was commanding. "I need access to your comms. You have a breach in your security, and you won't even know what hit you until it's too late." Orlov stared at her, disbelief mixing with a growing sense of urgency. "You're talking in riddles." She didn't flinch, her gaze still locked on his. "You'll understand soon enough. Right now, you need to make a choice. Let me help you, or let the storm take everything you've worked for." Orlov felt the weight of her words settle on him like an anchor. The storm raged around them, the winds shrieking and biting, but her words cut through it all. She wasn't here by accident. This wasn't some lost civilian. No, this woman knew exactly what she was doing, and more importantly, she knew exactly what was coming. Orlov's hand tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder. His instincts screamed at him to act, but something inside him hesitated. The woman, Major Ekaterina Kuznetsova, stood before him, calm in the face of everything. The soldier in Orlov wanted to trust her, but the officer in him couldn't ignore the questions that burned at the back of his mind. "I don't know who you are, but I know this. We can't afford to waste time," Orlov said, trying to regain control. "If you're here to help, then you'd better start giving us some answers." Kuznetsova's expression didn't change. "You'll have them, Sergeant, but only when you're ready to hear them." Her words were heavy, laden with a knowledge that made Orlov uneasy. The soldiers around him shifted, some eager for direction, others uncertain, like they could sense the growing tension in the air. Orlov swallowed hard and motioned for the team to move forward. Makarov, get the searchlight. Ivanov, stay on comms. Everyone else, follow me. Kuznetsova followed them, her presence a steady pulse behind him. They made their way to the command center, where the radio crackled to life once more. Private Karpov here. We've got movement on the northern perimeter. Looks like more than one. Something's wrong, Sergeant. Orlov's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Karpov's voice was urgent, panicked. There's no vehicle signatures, but there are footprints. Military-grade boots. They're coming fast. Orlov turned sharply. Makarov, get the cameras on the northern perimeter. The camera screens flickered to life, showing a blurry image of the vast white expanse outside. Nothing. But there was something off in the motion sensor data. Something moving, something that shouldn't be there. Kuznetsova stepped up beside Orlov, her gaze scanning the screens with a quiet intensity. They've breached the first perimeter, she said calmly. And they'll breach the second soon enough. You're out of time. Orlov turned to her, the pressure of the situation sinking in. What do you know about these people? Why are they targeting us? Kuznetsova didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her boots crunching on the snow as she approached the command console. She studied the maps for a moment before turning back to him. They're not here for you, not for your men. They're here for something you don't even know you have. Orlov's brow furrowed in confusion. What the hell are you talking about? Kuznetsova met his gaze, and for the first time, Orlov saw something flicker in her eyes. A fleeting moment of compassion, quickly masked by the steel determination that lay beneath. I'm talking about the data, she said. The data you're transmitting from this outpost. Whoever's behind this, they want that, badly. Orlov's blood ran cold. He didn't need to ask what data she was talking about. The outpost was responsible for handling communications from the northern sector. Highly sensitive, military-grade intel. The kind of intel that could be deadly in the wrong hands. They're going to try and take it, Kuznetsova continued. They're going to try and take everything you've worked for, everything you've guarded, and they'll make sure no one survives to talk about it. Orlov felt his breath catch in his throat. He'd always known this job was dangerous, but this was something else entirely. The enemy wasn't just coming for a physical attack. They were targeting the very foundation of the mission, the data, the heart of their operations. How do you know all this? Orlov demanded. Kuznetsova's eyes narrowed. Because I've been hunting them for years. Orlov stared at her, at the quiet confidence in her words, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he felt a flicker of hope. They had one chance to survive this, and it rested in the hands of someone who was as much a ghost as she was a soldier. She turned back to the team. We need to make a stand here, she said, her voice carrying a weight that commanded immediate attention. You're going to need to trust me, and you're going to need to do it now. The tension in the room was palpable as Kuznetsova's words hung in the air. Orlov's team was used to facing danger, to the cold, to the endless white landscape outside their fortified walls. But this was different. They were no longer just soldiers holding a position. They were now participants in a game they didn't fully understand, with stakes that could cost them everything. Orlov's mind raced as he looked at the woman who stood before him. Her calm was unnerving, but it was the kind of calm that often accompanied those who had seen too much, had done too much. He had a choice, either trust her or lose everything. He nodded slowly. All right, what do we do? Kuznetsova moved quickly, her voice decisive. We fortify the north side first. You know your positions. Makarov, get to the surveillance station and lock down all communications. Ivanov, keep monitoring the perimeter. Petrov, you're with me. We need to secure the comms room and keep the data from falling into enemy hands. The team moved into action, the steady rhythm of practiced professionalism taking over as each soldier fell into their role. Orlov watched as Kuznetsova moved with precision, every step calculated. She was everything he wasn't in that moment. Calm, controlled, a master of the situation. He felt the pressure to rise to her level, but it wasn't easy. As the team scrambled to secure the outpost, Kuznetsova pulled Orlov aside, her voice lowered. The data thereafter, it's not just about military intel. It's something more. You don't want to know how much more, but if they get their hands on it, this whole operation is compromised. Orlov swallowed hard. What do you mean by more? Kuznetsova hesitated, glancing at the door before leaning closer. It's not just about soldiers or missions or classified operations. There's something else buried in that data, something that could change everything. Your job is to protect it. My job is to make sure it stays protected. Orlov felt his heart race. You're talking about something big, aren't you? She nodded. Bigger than you can imagine. A crash interrupted their conversation. The first breach had come. The soldiers on the perimeter had detected movement, more than one enemy combatant closing in fast. Orlov grabbed his rifle, moving to the breach point with Kuznetsova right behind him. She didn't run. She didn't need to. Her steps were measured, purposeful, as she kept her head on a swivel, scanning the area with an expert's eye. They're here, Orlov muttered, barely able to hear himself over the wind and the roar of the storm. We need to stop them now. Kuznetsova didn't respond immediately, instead signaling for Orlov to follow her. They moved to the northern edge of the compound, where the enemy was likely to breach. Kuznetsova's training was evident in every move. She was calm, efficient, already planning their next steps. They crouched behind a snowbank, peering through the flurry of white and grey. For a moment, everything was still, too still. Then a shape emerged from the snow. Two figures, their silhouettes barely visible against the storm's fury. Orlov's breath caught in his throat. They've got cover, Ba, he said. We can't see them clearly. Kuznetsova looked at him, her expression unreadable. They won't see us coming, not yet. Her voice was steady, like she knew exactly what to expect. We'll wait for them to make the first move. Orlov could feel the tension building, a knot tightening in his chest. The enemy was out there, somewhere in the storm, but for all their training, they were still human. They still had to follow the rules of engagement, the rules of the game. Kuznetsova's plan was simple. Wait for them to make the first move, then counterattack. She knew how this would play out, and Orlov had to trust her. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. The cold wasn't just outside, it was inside him too. The enemy's footsteps grew louder, the sound of boots crunching against the snow. Orlov tensed, his rifle ready. On my signal, Kuznetsova said, her voice quiet but commanding. Wait for it. Orlov's pulse thudded in his ears as the figures drew closer. He could almost see the glint of their weapons through the snow, barely visible, but they were getting closer. Too close. Then the signal came. Kuznetsova moved like lightning, her rifle snapping up as she fired a single shot. A figure dropped. The other scrambled for cover, but it was too late. The team was on them, swarming from every angle. Orlov moved forward, his rifle trained on the second target. The enemy was fast, well-trained, but they weren't prepared for the storm. They weren't prepared for Kuznetsova. Orlov's shot rang out, hitting its mark. The second enemy fell, his body crumpling in the snow. Kuznetsova didn't wait. She was already moving, assessing the situation, making decisions in real time. Orlov followed her, his mind racing. That's two down, he said, his voice gruff with adrenaline. How many more? Kuznetsova didn't respond. She was already scanning the horizon, her gaze sharp and focused. The enemy wasn't done. They never were. The storm was thickening again, the snow swirling in chaotic gusts, but Kuznetsova's gaze remained unwavering. She raised her hand, signaling for the team to stay low. Orlov followed her lead, crouching behind a snowbank, his rifle ready. They were exposed here, too close to the breach point, but Kuznetsova didn't seem to care. She was focused, her mind already calculating their next move. The rest of the team was positioned further back, securing their perimeter, but Orlov knew they couldn't afford to lose track of the enemy. They had been silent for too long. Kuznetsova's eyes narrowed as she peered through the storm, scanning for movement. They're regrouping, she muttered. Orlov's pulse quickened. He had expected more immediate action, but the enemy was playing it cautious. That only made things worse. How many do you think they've got? Orlov asked, his voice low. Kuznetsova didn't answer immediately. She had her attention fixed on something in the distance. After a long moment, she smirked. At least 6. Probably more. They're not alone. Orlov felt his stomach tighten. If they had reinforcements coming, this was going to get a lot more complicated. The team had no idea how many attackers they were facing, no way of knowing the full scope of the situation, but Kuznetsova had already seen what he couldn't. "We need to move now," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "They'll be on us before we know it. We don't have the advantage here." Orlov's mind raced. He wanted to argue, but there was no time. Kuznetsova was right. Every second they wasted was another step closer to losing control. "You heard her," Orlov shouted to the team. "Move out." They moved in synchronized silence, each soldier taking their designated position. The weight of the mission pressed down on them, but Kuznetsova led with a confidence that Orlov could barely understand. As they moved, Orlov kept a sharp eye on Kuznetsova. There was something about the way she moved, something unsettlingly precise. It wasn't just her training, it was the calm certainty that came from experience, from having faced down the worst and come out on top. Orlov's thoughts were interrupted by a shout from Makarov. "Sarge, something's wrong." Orlov spun, his rifle snapping up in an instant. Makarov was standing near the western perimeter, his face pale as he stared at the monitors. "They're not just here for the data," Makarov said, his voice trembling. "They've got an extraction team coming. They're here to clean up." Orlov's stomach dropped. "How do you know that?" Makarov turned, his eyes wide with fear. "I've been monitoring the radio chatter. It's all coded, but there's a pattern. They've got a chopper inbound." Orlov's mind raced. An extraction team? That meant the enemy wasn't just a rogue group. They were part of something larger, something that would stop at nothing to cover their tracks. Kuznetsova was already moving, her rifle raised as she scanned the horizon. "We're not going to make it," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "They'll have air support, and once that chopper hits, we'll be sitting ducks." Orlov's heart hammered in his chest. The odds had just shifted drastically. But Kuznetsova didn't seem to care. She was already formulating their next move, calculating the window they had left. "We've got one shot," she said, turning to Orlov. "We need to take them out now, before they get the chopper in the air. If we don't, it's over." Orlov didn't hesitate. He nodded. "All right, let's move." Kuznetsova raised her hand, signaling for them to move out. The team split into two groups, covering as much ground as they could in the shifting storm. Orlov stayed close to Kuznetsova, trusting her to lead the way. They had one shot, and it was all riding on this moment. As they moved into position, Orlov's thoughts kept racing. How had this turned into something so much bigger than just a simple outpost defense? Who were these people, and what had they been after? But those questions would have to wait, for now they had to survive. The wind howled, and the storm blinded them. But Kuznetsova's eyes never wavered. She moved like a shadow, and Orlov could feel her focus cutting through the chaos around them. The enemy had made their move. Now it was time to make theirs. The blizzard roared around them as Orlov and Kuznetsova moved through the snow, their boots crunching in the deepening drifts. The rest of the team was close behind, but the storm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Orlov's pulse hammered in his ears as they approached the eastern breach point. Kuznetsova's presence was like a steady force beside him, her every step measured, her gaze always ahead, calculating. Orlov could feel the pressure mounting. They were about to face something they weren't prepared for, something far bigger than they had expected. Kuznetsova stopped suddenly, raising a hand. Orlov froze beside her, his rifle tight in his grip. Ahead, through the snow, he saw nothing. No movement, no sign of the enemy. But Kuznetsova was watching the right side of the compound, her eyes narrowing. "They're here," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. Orlov's heart skipped. "Where?" She motioned toward the wall of the outpost, a quick glance toward the shadows just beyond the reach of the searchlights. "They're moving to flank. We've got to beat them to it." The adrenaline shot through Orlov's veins. They had no time to lose. Orlov motioned for the team to spread out, his eyes constantly flicking back to Kuznetsova, watching her every move. She was already moving toward the side of the outpost, her steps swift and confident. The plan was simple: get ahead of the enemy, cut them off before they could position themselves for an attack. But it was also incredibly risky. They had no idea how many hostiles were out there. Orlov's fingers clenched around his rifle. "Stay sharp," he muttered to the team. "We take them fast, we take them hard." They reached the far side of the building, moving in sync. Orlov had the lead, his senses on high alert, his rifle raised, but there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just the endless snow and the biting cold. He moved to the corner of the building, his breath coming out in sharp bursts, and peered around. There. He saw it, a flicker of motion, a shadow darting behind the equipment shed. "Contact!" Orlov shouted, raising his rifle. Kuznetsova was already ahead of him, moving like a ghost. Her shot rang out, the sound deafening in the stillness of the storm. A figure dropped in the snow, but the rest of them were already scattering, finding cover. "Move!" Kuznetsova barked, her voice cutting through the wind. "They're too spread out. Don't give them a chance to regroup." The team sprang into action, each soldier moving with precision, their training kicking in as they fanned out. Orlov followed Kuznetsova, his rifle aimed forward. He had no time to think, just to react. Every part of his body was on edge. They reached the far side of the outpost, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of the enemy. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The snow fell in thick, heavy sheets. The enemy had vanished. "Where are they?" Orlov muttered, his breath coming out in sharp gasps. "They're pulling back," Kuznetsova said, her voice low and calm, but with an edge to it. "They've been watching us, waiting for the right moment. And now they're waiting for us to make the first move." Orlov's mind raced. If they were pulling back, they were regrouping. If they were regrouping, that meant they had reinforcements. This wasn't over. Kuznetsova's gaze moved toward the northern edge of the compound. "They're making their final push. We need to hold them off or we'll lose everything." Orlov nodded, his heart pounding. "We're ready." Kuznetsova stepped forward, her eyes scanning the darkness, calculating their next move. "Stay low, move fast, and don't miss your shots." They spread out again, moving toward the northern breach point, their eyes darting to the shadows ahead. The storm was their only ally now, hiding them from the enemy, but it also kept them from seeing what was coming. Every step felt like an eternity. Every moment was filled with the sense of something terrible waiting to happen. Then the gunfire started. It was like a sudden explosion of noise, the sharp crack of rifles cutting through the stillness of the storm. Orlov's heart raced as he dove into cover, his rifle raised, aiming into the dark. The enemy was close now, closer than he'd ever expected, and they weren't pulling back this time. Kuznetsova's voice came through his earpiece, calm and steady. "Hold the line. They're coming in from all sides. If we lose the north wall, we're finished." Orlov's mind was already working, calculating their options, the best positions, the angles of fire. But it was too late for tactics now. The fight was here, and they had no choice but to face it head-on. The storm was deafening, the wind howling as if it were alive, tearing through the small gaps in the outpost's walls. Orlov could barely hear his own thoughts, the sound of gunfire filling the space between each gust of wind. He crouched behind a large stack of crates, his rifle aimed at the entrance to the northern breach. The enemy was close. Too close. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating. Kuznetsova's voice crackled through his earpiece, steady and measured. "They've split into two teams," she said. "One's making a direct assault on the north wall, the other's coming around from the west. They're trying to force us into a corner." Orlov's heart pounded. The situation was worse than he'd thought. They had no idea how many attackers were out there, and now they were splitting their forces, pushing from multiple angles. Orlov's mind raced. "We need reinforcements," he said, barely able to hear his own voice over the chaos. "We can't hold out much longer." "There are no reinforcements coming." Kuznetsova's voice was grim but calm. "This is it. This is your last stand." Orlov gritted his teeth. "Then we fight." He shifted positions, glancing quickly at the other soldiers. Makarov, Ivanov, and Petrov were all in position, their rifles trained on the breach. They were ready. Kuznetsova, ever the professional, was already moving, her eyes scanning the perimeter, calculating their next move. She wasn't just fighting the enemy, she was playing a game of strategy, and she was several steps ahead of everyone else. "We need to force them into the open," Kuznetsova said, her voice low but commanding. "Makarov, take the south exit. Ivanov, move to the west side. We're going to give them something to chase." Orlov's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Kuznetsova's eyes met his, her gaze steady. "We're going to draw them out. They'll think they've got us cornered. and then we take them out one by one. Orlov wasn't sure if he was ready for this. They were still outnumbered, still in the middle of a blizzard with no way of calling for backup. But he couldn't argue with her. Kuznetsova had seen things he couldn't even begin to imagine. And if anyone could turn this around, it was her. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "Let's do it." The team moved quickly, splitting into their designated positions. Orlov moved with Kuznetsova, covering the north side. The rest of the team spread out, each soldier taking their place, ready to respond when the enemy made their move. Time seemed to slow as they waited, each second feeling like an eternity. Then the enemy made their move. A burst of gunfire erupted from the western side, followed by shouting. Orlov could hear the enemy's heavy boots crunching through the snow, their movements frantic. They were closing in, just as Kuznetsova had predicted. "Now!" Kuznetsova shouted. Orlov's heart raced as he popped up from his cover, his rifle aimed at the first enemy combatant. He fired, the shot ringing out in the silence of the storm. The enemy dropped, but there were more, too many more. Orlov shifted position, firing again, his shots landing with deadly precision, but the enemy was relentless. They were coming from all sides now, and Orlov knew they had no choice but to fight until the end. Kuznetsova moved like a shadow, her rifle never missing its mark. She was everywhere, directing the team with precision, keeping the pressure on the enemy at every turn. Orlov couldn't keep up with her. She was too fast, too efficient. Every move she made was calculated, every shot fired with purpose. But they were still outnumbered. Orlov could feel the weight of that reality pressing down on him. The team was holding their ground, but the enemy wasn't backing down. They were closing in. "They're trying to flank us." Makarov's voice crackled through Orlov's earpiece. "We need to pull back." Orlov didn't have time to think. "Hold the line," he shouted. "We're not giving up this position." He could feel the pressure mounting. They couldn't hold out much longer. The storm was their only ally now, covering their movements, but it was also their biggest enemy. It was impossible to see anything beyond a few feet in any direction. The wind howled like a living thing, disorienting them. Orlov fired again, his rifle crackling in the silence, but there were too many enemies closing in. They had to act fast. "Kuznetsova," Orlov shouted, "we need a plan." Kuznetsova glanced at him, her expression unwavering. "We take the fight to them. No more waiting." With that, she moved toward the western side, her rifle raised, her steps quick and precise. Orlov followed, heart racing, his mind spinning. This was it. The final push. There was no turning back now. The ground beneath Orlov's boots was treacherous, the snow deep enough to slow their movements, but not deep enough to offer full cover. Kuznetsova led the way, her posture straight and unyielding. Every step, every movement was deliberate. Orlov stayed close, his rifle trained on the shadows, scanning for any sign of movement. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him, the cold seeping through his gear. But it wasn't the weather that weighed on him. It was the realization that they were surrounded, and the enemy wasn't going to stop, not until they had what they came for. "The flank is clear for now," Kuznetsova said, her voice low but steady as she crouched behind a snowbank. "But don't expect it to stay that way." Orlov nodded, his breath visible in the air. "So, what now?" Kuznetsova didn't hesitate. "We push forward, we force them to fight us on our terms." Orlov felt a knot tighten in his stomach. There was no room for mistakes now. They had no backup, no reinforcements. If they were going to survive, they had to act quickly and decisively. Kuznetsova moved again, her eyes scanning the horizon. "They'll think we're retreating. That's when we hit them." Orlov took a deep breath and followed. They moved quickly through the storm, the only sounds their boots crunching in the snow and the faint whistling of the wind. The others were in position now, each soldier in their designated spot, waiting for the signal to strike. Orlov didn't take his eyes off Kuznetsova. She was the only one who seemed unaffected by the chaos around them. She had already calculated their next move, their next shot. She was several steps ahead, and Orlov couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. He was used to being in control, to being the one who led the charge, but Kuznetsova made him feel like an amateur. They reached the eastern side of the outpost, and Kuznetsova motioned for them to stop. "We're almost there," she whispered. Orlov could barely make out her figure in the thick snow. The enemy was close now, too close. Orlov's hands were cold, his fingers numb from the biting wind, but he didn't dare take off his gloves. They were too far into this now. The enemy would be on them in seconds. Orlov scanned the area. There. He saw a shadow moving through the snow, a figure darting behind a pile of crates. He raised his rifle, but Kuznetsova's hand shot out to stop him. "Wait," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Let them come to us." Orlov's teeth clenched. Every instinct in him screamed to shoot, but he trusted Kuznetsova's judgment. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Another figure appeared, moving cautiously but with purpose. Orlov held his breath, watching as they moved closer, closer. The enemy was walking right into their trap. "Now!" Kuznetsova shouted. Orlov's rifle cracked through the air, followed by a series of shots from the rest of the team. The first enemy soldier dropped in the snow. The second one hesitated, momentarily disoriented by the sudden assault. Orlov didn't hesitate. He fired again, the shot landing with precision. Another enemy down. Kuznetsova was already moving, her rifle raised as she darted across the open ground, heading straight for the next group of attackers. Orlov followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The storm seemed to intensify around them, but the adrenaline inside him kept him focused. They couldn't let up. Not now. The rest of the team was engaging the enemy, their shots precise and controlled. Orlov could hear Kuznetsova's voice in his earpiece, directing them, giving them orders. It was clear now. This was her fight, and they were just following her lead. Orlov took position behind a set of crates, his rifle aimed at the next target. He saw the enemy soldiers scrambling for cover, but it was too late. The team had them cornered. Orlov squeezed the trigger. Another enemy fell. The sound of gunfire echoed through the snow, blending with the howling wind. They were making their stand. "Push forward," Kuznetsova shouted. Orlov didn't need to be told twice. They moved as a unit, sweeping through the storm, each step calculated, each movement purposeful. The enemy was retreating now, but it was clear that they were still trying to regroup, still trying to find a way to break through, but Orlov and his team weren't about to let them. Kuznetsova's voice was a steady presence in his earpiece. "They're not giving up. They'll try to force their way through, but they're running out of time." Orlov could see it now. The enemy wasn't just running. They were desperate. Their movements were sloppy, erratic, and that was the opening they needed. The final push was coming. They just had to hold out for a little longer. Orlov tightened his grip on his rifle and moved forward. The team followed, each soldier moving with determination, their breaths visible in the freezing air. This was it, the end game. Orlov could feel his adrenaline surge, his body moving faster than it had in days. They had one chance, one shot to end this. And if they failed, it would be the end of everything. But Orlov wasn't about to fail. Not now, not after everything they had been through. The sound of gunfire echoed through the compound as Orlov and his team surged forward. The enemy was retreating, but they weren't done yet. They were still trying to regroup, still trying to make a last-ditch effort to breach the defenses. Orlov's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline flooding his veins. Every step they took brought them closer to the final confrontation, but also closer to the possibility of failure. The team moved with precision, their rifles raised, their eyes scanning the snow and shadows for any sign of movement. Kuznetsova's voice came through Orlov's earpiece, steady and commanding as always. "We're almost there," she said. "They're running out of options." Orlov nodded, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The enemy was trying to break through the northern gate, but they hadn't anticipated Kuznetsova's team. They hadn't anticipated her. "Stay sharp," Orlov muttered to the team, his eyes darting across the compound. "We don't let them get a single inch." The rest of the team moved into position, their eyes trained on the northern breach point. Orlov kept his rifle steady, his senses alert for any sound, any movement that didn't belong. The wind howled around them, but the storm wasn't enough to drown out the sounds of approaching footsteps. There, at the edge of the compound, he saw them, figures moving fast, trying to cover the distance in the storm. Orlov's finger hovered over the trigger, but Kuznetsova's voice rang through his earpiece. "Wait, let them come closer." Orlov's instincts screamed at him to fire, to take the shot now before they could position themselves. But Kuznetsova had been right so far. She was the one who knew how to play this game. So he held his fire, waiting for the signal. The figures came closer, their movement erratic but purposeful. Orlov's grip tightened on his rifle as they closed the distance. They were almost in range. Then Kuznetsova spoke. "Now!" Orlov didn't hesitate. He fired, the shot cutting through the storm. The first enemy soldier dropped, and the rest of the team opened fire. The compound was filled with the deafening sound of gunfire as the team worked in unison, their shots precise and controlled. The enemy didn't stand a chance. Orlov moved forward, his rifle trained on the next target, but the enemy was already retreating, scrambling for cover. They weren't expecting the resistance they had encountered. They were losing. Kuznetsova's voice came through again, calm and measured. "Push them back. Don't let them regroup." Orlov didn't need to be told twice. He moved with the team, sweeping through the compound, driving the enemy back. Every movement felt like a step closer to victory, but Orlov couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, still being hunted. The enemy wasn't done. They were regrouping, trying to find a way to break through. But Kuznetsova was ahead of them, already calculating their next move. The team moved forward, their rifles trained on the shadows, waiting for the next sign of movement. Orlov could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The enemy was too close. "Hold the line," Kuznetsova shouted, her voice cutting through the wind. "We can't let them breach the outer perimeter." Orlov's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the final push. There was no time to hesitate. The team moved in sync, each soldier taking their position, ready to fight until the end. They were outnumbered, but they were determined. They had no choice but to win. "Focus on the north side," Kuznetsova ordered. "They'll try to force their way through there." Orlov nodded, his mind racing. The enemy was getting desperate, but so were they. The storm was their only ally now. It was covering their movements, but it was also making it impossible to see anything. Orlov could barely make out the shapes in front of him, but he trusted Kuznetsova. She knew exactly where to go, exactly what to do. The enemy was trying to make their move, but they were too late. The team was already ahead of them. Orlov moved forward, his rifle aimed at the shadows. This was it. The final stand. The final moments of the battle unfolded in a tense, unrelenting silence, broken only by the sounds of muffled gunfire and the wind tearing through the snow. Orlov's muscles burned from the cold and the adrenaline, but there was no time to rest. Every moment felt like a lifetime as he and his team advanced into the storm. Kuznetsova moved like a shadow beside him, leading them forward with the calm precision of someone who had been in situations far worse than this. Orlov had no doubt now. This was her battlefield, and they were just trying to survive it. The enemy was on the retreat, but Orlov knew they would be back. There was no way they would give up so easily. They had their orders, and they would follow them to the bitter end. Kuznetsova's voice came through his earpiece again, steady and commanding. "They're regrouping. We've got maybe 5 minutes before they come back for a second wave. We need to make sure they don't get back up." Orlov's heart thudded in his chest. 5 minutes wasn't enough. They had no idea how many more were coming, how many they could hold off. Kuznetsova had a plan, though, and that was the only thing that kept Orlov going. "Get to the secondary perimeter," she said. "We'll set up a defensive position. Keep your heads down." Orlov didn't need to be told twice. He motioned for the team to move, each soldier taking cover behind the nearest objects in the snow. They could barely see. The storm was so thick, but they knew the area well. They had trained here. They had spent countless hours learning the terrain. This was the moment it all came down to. This was why they had fought for years. The enemy was closing in again. Orlov could hear the faint sounds of boots crunching in the snow. They were getting closer, too close. Kuznetsova raised her hand, signaling for the team to stay still. "Not yet," she murmured. Orlov's breath was coming in sharp gasps, his rifle aimed at the approaching figures, but Kuznetsova was right. They had to wait. Every second counted now. Then, as if on cue, the first figure emerged from the storm, moving fast but cautiously. Orlov's finger hovered over the trigger. "Wait for it," Kuznetsova said softly. The figure paused, scanning the area, but not for long. Orlov knew they wouldn't hesitate much longer. They couldn't. The team was ready. Now, Kuznetsova shouted. The barrage of gunfire erupted all at once, a deafening roar that filled the air. Orlov's heart pounded as he watched the enemy soldier drop to the ground. The others scattered, taking cover behind the snowdrifts and the remains of the equipment. But it didn't matter. They were outgunned. Orlov moved, his rifle steady as he picked off another enemy soldier, but the rest were already retreating, falling back into the storm. Kuznetsova motioned for the team to regroup, and they moved quickly, staying low, staying tight. The enemy was retreating, but Kuznetsova's expression didn't change. She knew this was just the first wave. The storm had given them an advantage, but it was fading. The enemy would come again, and next time they would be ready. "Is it over?" Orlov asked, his voice low as he caught his breath. Kuznetsova looked at him, her eyes hard. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the cold. "It's never over." The wind howled again, the storm pushing back against them as if it were alive, unwilling to let them forget the danger that still lay ahead. But for now, they had won. The team moved to the outer perimeter, securing the area, checking for any sign of further movement. The storm was beginning to ease, the snow turning from a blinding curtain to a steady fall, but the danger wasn't over yet. Orlov watched Kuznetsova as she moved through the compound, her mind already on the next step. She wasn't just surviving, she was planning. And that was the difference. For the first time in hours, Orlov allowed himself to take a breath. The storm outside had finally begun to break. But in the distance, Orlov knew the battle wasn't over. He wouldn't relax until they were sure. And even then, there would always be something left unanswered, something left unsaid. They had survived this attack, but there was no way to know what would come next. "Do you know who I am now?" Kuznetsova had asked them earlier, her voice steady and unwavering. Orlov hadn't known the answer then. But now, as the team began to regroup and the first hints of dawn broke through the clouds, he realized the truth. The answer didn't matter. What mattered was that she had been the one to lead them through the storm, and that was enough. "We live to fight another day," Orlov muttered to himself as he watched the team prepare. He turned to Kuznetsova, who was already preparing for whatever came next. "I know who you are now." Kuznetsova nodded, her eyes focused on the horizon. "I know, but right now we keep moving." The storm was breaking. The first light of day was creeping over the horizon. But Orlov knew that their real fight had only just begun, and that, with Kuznetsova at their side, they would face whatever came next with the same quiet resolve.